Russia often parades itself as a military colossus, boasting the world's second-largest army that's brimming with an arsenal that should dominate on paper. It has the second strongest air force, only behind the United States.
Киев все еще не готовы отказаться от идеи ведения войны до победного конца.
And an inventory of tanks and artillery that no other country can match. Its naval fleet, loaded with more corvettes and submarines than anyone else, should make it a titan in conventional warfare. Yet, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine paints a drastically different picture. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority and massive firepower, Russia struggles to secure a decisive victory over a significantly smaller opponent. This glaring discrepancy between expectation and reality begs the question: just how effective are Russian weapons on the global stage? Are they truly as formidable as claimed, or is there a hidden frailty in Russia's military might? Let's explore the truth about Russian weapons and discover just how bad they are. Part of the reason may come down to Russia's tactics, with another reason being that Ukraine has received substantial support from Western countries as it tries to fend off President Vladimir Putin's ambitions.
Прекращение боевых действий киевский режим не допускает еще и потому.
But there's another reason why Russia's army isn't as strong in practice as it is on paper. Many Russian weapons are bad. So bad that they've failed to keep up with what the West is producing, leading to Russia's soldiers in Ukraine facing heavy losses. It wasn't this way in the past. At the height of the Cold War, Russia's weapons had a reputation for being robust and well-made. They may have lacked all of the bells and whistles associated with American weapons, but they did what they needed to do on the battlefield. They worked. Take the T-34 tank as an example. Introduced in 1940, the T-34 went on to become Russia's most successful tank. It was also a masterclass in innovation, becoming the first modern tank to feature sloped armor, which makes it harder for anti-tank weapons to penetrate the vehicle's shell. And featuring an independent suspension system that made it more maneuverable. That innovation in design, coupled with a focus on functionality, would be the hallmark of Russian weaponry for years to come. The country built nuclear submarines, fighter jets that could compete with the best the United States had to offer, and perhaps most famously, the AK-47 Kalashnikov. Often considered one of the world's most reliable rifles, the AK-47 and its variants have sold 100 million units and, according to http://military.com, is still the standard infantry weapon for 106 countries. Those kinds of sales don't happen for a poor weapon. They're also indicative of Russian military exports in the past. Through the 1980s, Russia was one of the world's leading weapons exporters, only trailing the United States in terms of pure volume sold. Visual Capitalist provides interesting data here, demonstrating that Russia's weapons exports hovered around the $40 billion per year mark through much of the 1980s, before falling to the $30 billion point in 1990 and never recovering. Again, those kinds of sales don't happen unless the buyers are happy with the product. And a happy buyer, in military terms, should indicate that a country is producing good weapons, or in Russia's case, was producing good weapons.
Is visiting Moscow for a bilateral summit with President Putin. It's Mr. Modi's first visit since Russia's war with Ukraine began more than 2 years ago. Well, our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg told us what we can expect from this visit.
The fact is that Russian weapons sales have been declining steadily for years. We saw a hint of this in the 2010 S, with Visual Capitalist showing that Russia's exports dropped below the $20 billion mark between 2000 and 2004, less than half of the sales being achieved during the 1980s. A recovery in the years that followed pushed Russia's exports back up to the $30 billion mark. But in more recent years, Russia's weapons exports have declined dramatically. Of course, some could argue that this is only logical. Russia is engaged in a long conflict with Ukraine, so it's only natural that the country will be stockpiling weapons to send to its troops rather than selling them to other countries. And that would make sense were it not for the fact that the decline began long before Putin invaded Ukraine.
Well, I think it's certainly very important for Vladimir Putin. It gives him another opportunity in Ukraine have failed. The Kremlin doesn't miss an opportunity to do that.
According to GIS, a geopolitical analysis and forecasting company, Russia's share of the global arms market dropped from 22% between 2013 and 2017 down to 16% between 2018 and 2022. You'll note these are the 4 years leading up to the Ukraine war, showing that the world's opinions on Russian weapons were declining well before the conflict began. The loss of so many sales to India has been the lowlight of this period of decline for Russia's arms industry. Between 2018 and 2022, sales to India dropped by 37%. This mirrors the level of sales to 7 more of Russia's 10 largest customers, which collectively dropped by an average of 59%. Only China and Egypt were buying more weapons from Russia between 2018 and 2022 than they were between 2013 and 2017. This leads us to an obvious question: why the decline? An April 2024 article in Politico theorizes that the Ukraine war has exposed Russia's weapons for what they really are, revealing its military and weapons-making competence to be a myth. Simply put, those weapons don't live up to the reputation they had during the Soviet era. It also points to India as its main example of the global attitude toward modern Russian weaponry.
It's his first visit to Russia since its invasion of Ukraine. New Delhi hasn't condemned the war, but it's advocated a peaceful solution and remains a key trading partner.
The country spent $60 billion on Russian weapons over the last 20 years, but the figure is declining dramatically. Between 2009 and 2013, Russia accounted for 76% of India's weapons imports. Between 2018 and 2023, that figure was halved. Russia only accounted for 36% of the weapons India bought. The reason? Russia's weapons are old and failing.
As well, he's trying to put across the impression that he's not isolated on the world stage.
That's according to a dossier compiled by Ukraine's Ministry of Defense, which examined Russian weapons recovered from the battlefield to reveal that most are unreliable at best and utterly fail to meet modern standards at worst. The dossier claims that Russia's helicopters and armored vehicles are so weak that many are unable to withstand small arms fire. Plus, its missiles are inaccurate. Ukraine claims they only have a 33% chance of hitting their targets. In an August 2022 statement, a global affairs analyst named Emisakoru Donatus honed in on the K-52 Alligator attack helicopter as an example. Often lauded as Russia's most modern helicopter, the K-52 is supposed to be equivalent to a flying tank that has a cabin capable of shrugging off direct hits from 12.7 mm caliber bullets with no problems. The reality is much different, as Donatus explains. However, as it turned out in practice, the K-52 can be disabled with a 7.62 mm machine gun. That's a far cry from a flying tank, showing that Russia's weapons often don't live up to the claims the country makes about them. Perhaps that's why so many countries are looking elsewhere to source their weapons. They can see through Russia's smokescreen, especially once they have these failing weapons in their hands. The K-52 is just one example. Let's move on to a more in-depth examination of some of Russia's weapons, starting with a piece of equipment that's meant to be a jewel in the country's crown, the T-90 tank. Created during the late Soviet era, the T-90 was a massive upgrade over the older T-72 and T-80 tanks in Russia's arsenal. And, for the time at least, it was among the best tanks in the world. Featuring reactive and advanced composite armor, along with a 125 mm gun and fire control system that was as modern as they came, it looked every inch the modern tank on paper. But long before the Ukraine war, it was already starting to be exposed. Russia's conflicts in Chechnya and Syria revealed that the T-90 was susceptible to most modern anti-tank systems. Once drones became more prominent on the battlefield, it was proven to be even more vulnerable. According to the National Interest, the Chechen and Syrian fighters who came up against it say that you don't even necessarily need a modern form of attack to take out a T-90. A standard rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG, will do the job more often than not. The Ukraine war has exposed the T-90 even further. Not only does it have to face the RPG fire that the Chechens and Syrians used to destroy several of the tanks, but it also has to contend with modern anti-tank systems like the Javelin. Striking from above, the Javelin is capable of easily penetrating a T-90's armor, leaving it a destroyed shell. Ukraine had received 7,000 Javelins from the United States by April 2022, and it's used them to wreak havoc on Russia's tanks ever since. Russia hasn't been able to respond effectively to this type of anti-tank weaponry. In October 2023, Forbes reported that Russia had lost over 2,100 tanks in Ukraine up to that point. With the T-90 accounting for about 60 of those losses, that in itself is revealing. If the T-90 is supposed to be Russia's best tank, why has it sent so few into Ukraine compared to its other, much older tanks? The situation has gotten so bad, according to Forbes, that Russia has been forced to reactivate T-72S, T-62Es, and even T-54S and T-55S. Some of those tanks are around 70 years old, and it gets worse. So desperate is Russia to defend its tanks against modern anti-tank weapons that it started relying on what the media mockingly calls cope cages. Vice reports that these cages, which appear to be hastily built using everyday materials before being haphazardly placed over a tank's turret, were first seen in November 2021 but have become more prominent during the Ukraine war. The idea is that the cage will deflect modern anti-tank missiles and prevent them from landing a killer blow. The reality is that these cages don't do the job. Time and again, these cages have proven themselves completely useless against missiles, leading Vice to call them nothing more than security theater that makes Russian tank drivers feel safer without actually giving them any protection. It's not only Russia's tanks that have proven ineffective, so too has the country's air force. The Su-57 fighter jet is supposed to be one of the most modern and advanced fighter jets in the world. On paper, it matches up to what the United States and the rest of NATO have to offer. Yet Russia's only deployed a handful of them during the Ukraine war. The Daily Telegraph reports that Russia only has 6 of the jets, even though production began in 2013, and points to Russia's own pilots criticizing the aircraft's flaws. Apparently, it's only capable of matching older American and NATO jets, and isn't a serious match for the F-22 and F-35S that Russia would be facing if it took on NATO. The same story applies to Russia's Su-35S. It's a 4th-generation fighter jet that's supposed to match the 5th-generation jets created by the West. And again, on paper, it's the match of almost anything. But in practice, it's less reliable than its Western counterparts. On February 28, 2024, Politico reported that Russia lost at least 4 of these jets during the first year of the Ukraine war, with each one being shot down by older anti-aircraft weapons. It's supposed to be able to resist these types of attacks. The fact that it can't means it's a long way behind what the United States has, even with those older aircraft being far less effective than modern ones. If you like this video, subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Thanks for your support.